A link is in the chat for the materials, and we'll continue to put that link in the chat. So as people join, they can access the chat. Most of you, all of you do already have your cameras turned off. Thank you for that. We do ask for at least a minimum of your first name and your last initial. Thank you for being here for this webinar live. We anticipate that many more people will access the webinar through a recording. And so there are some points in the live webinar where we will say, if you're watching the recording, now would be a great time to pause it and talk with your colleagues or journal about the questions that you see on the screen. So that will be happening throughout the webinar. Laura, do you have any other housekeeping that you want to do tonight?
No, nothing I can think of. Thank you.
Awesome. So Laura's going to start the recording. Welcome, friends and colleagues, to the fourth webinar in a series of webinars about instructional strategies for teaching reading foundational skills. This webinar is focused specifically on the alphabetic principle and phonics in service to systematic and explicit foundational reading skills instruction. I am Barb Novak. I'm one of 2 literacy consultants at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and I'm joined by my knowledgeable colleague, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Adams, the other literacy consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. Thanks for being here with us.
As we said in the beginning, this webinar is the 4th webinar in a 6-part series. The series as a whole is about the role of explicit and systematic phonics instruction in learning to read. It offers a tool for evaluating your school or district system and how you engage students in learning reading foundational skills. Every episode in the series makes connections to Wisconsin's 2020 standards for English language arts, and there is an emphasis on learning and applying instructional strategies for explicit and systematic foundational skills instruction in the myriad learning environments that students are working in right now. Today, specifically, we are focused on the alphabetic principle and phonics. We'll provide a little bit of background information, talk about scope and sequence as it relates to the alphabetic principle and phonics. We'll make some connections to the first. We will talk about explicit instruction by offering some instructional strategies. We'll dip in a little bit about equitable multi-level system of support, give you some assessment tools. The school district of Belleville has a very powerful story to tell about its current work around alphabetic principle and phonics. And that story is so comprehensive that it's actually going to get its own bonus episode. We hope to record that bonus episode within the next week, and then it will be available online. So it could be as long as mid-February before it's available online, but it'll be probably about 30 to 45-minute conversation with a literacy leader in Belleville about what's happening with phonics there. That one is not available live. It'll just be available recorded. Again, here's the links to the materials for the session. You also get the links to, on this slide, the link to the recordings. And one reference that's used very heavily throughout this slide deck that's available publicly is a practice guide about reading foundational skills in service of comprehension that's available through IES. So we provided that link for you on this slide as well. Our previous webinars, webinar 1, 2, and 3 are on the screen. We do encourage you to take a look at, if you're jumping into the series, to make sure you go back and take a look at webinar 1 about the foundational reading skills tool. That webinar also really sets the context for reading foundational skills as one part of a much larger picture of what it means to be a reader. Which takes me pretty nicely to our guiding principles for this webinar series. We believe that student success comes from an intentional system, and the foundational reading skills tool is a way for you as a school or district to evaluate one very small component of your intentional system, which is reading foundational skills, specifically the development of letter sound knowledge. We also believe that foundational skills are one part of reading, and that comprehension, which is the ultimate goal of reading, results from fluency in context, which is built through foundational skills, but that comprehension is also the result of language comprehension and strategic knowledge. And we'll look more at that in a minute. Finally, explicit and systematic instruction is one of our guiding principles. You'll see this brought up throughout tonight's webinar. Systematic means that the instruction follows a predictable scope and sequence. Now, there is some space in there to make adjustments for what individual students need, but generally speaking, instruction follows a predictable scope and sequence. And instruction is explicit when it follows a gradual release of responsibility, starting with a clear and memorable model, including guided practice with error correction or coaching. And throughout that gradual release cycle, educators are using real precise language that enables students to complete the task. And that gradual release ends with very explicit teaching for transfer, so that students are able to apply the isolated skills that they're learning to what they do as readers, writers, and users of language. This is another reminder that decoding, which is what we're talking about pretty heavily tonight when we talk about phonics, is one part of an overall system of making meaning. We've all known kids, I'm sure, during our tenure as teachers that can decode fluently with minimal understanding. We also meet the occasional kid who has real thorough understanding and struggles with fluency. Students need the entire picture, all of the components of what it means to be a reader in order to be successful. And this is a visual representation of those components of a reader. So foundational skills lead to fluency and context. The skills that you see in the middle line in green, background knowledge, vocabulary, and structure, that leads to language comprehension. And what you see across the bottom in the rust color are cognitive skills, sometimes called comprehension skills, that lead to strategic knowledge. And all three of those components together, fluency and context, language comprehension, and strategic knowledge, together, those three things result in comprehension. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the components that are around the outside of the model: metacognition, social emotional learning, interest and relevancy, and choice and access. Those are things that influence all of the components that are inside the gold rectangle. If you are watching the recording of this webinar, now would be an excellent time to pause the recording and set some personal goals for the session related to alphabetic principle and phonics, and then think about what some of your local instructional resources are related to those two topics, and identify anything that you might want to review related to those two topics. So let's get into our first agenda point for tonight that's specific to alphabetic principle and phonics, and that's just some background information. So the alphabetic principle is the understanding that spoken words are composed of individual sounds and that printed letters represent those sounds. I think about it as sort of a space between phonemic awareness and phonics, when students are starting to make connections between spoken sounds and printed letters. I think another one of the guiding principles, especially for this particular webinar, is that these skills, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle, phonics, they don't develop discretely. So a student may very well still be working on phonological awareness and phonemic awareness as they're also working on the alphabetic principle and phonics. So lots of things are developing simultaneously in our young learners. Ultimately, this alphabetic principle helps students access phonics, which allows students to read with fluency. So that takes us to phonics, which is the study of the relationship between sounds and letters, the goal of which is to um, ensure that students learn the relationship between the letters of written language and the sounds of spoken language. The more automatic students become in understanding and applying those relationships in theory, the more fluent their reading becomes, and the less brain space they have to devote to brain power they have to devote to decoding, which frees up that brain power for other things. So again, we are talking about systematic and explicit instruction. So systematic and explicit instruction in alphabetic tonight in alphabetic principle and phonics. If you're looking for more information, there are a few slides after this one that are hidden, that have some definitions and some different approaches to teaching phonics and the explanations of those approaches. You can also reference the Wisconsin Model Academic Standards for English Language Arts, specifically Appendix 2 has further information about these concepts. So why does this matter? Why do alphabetic principle and phonics matter? Um, Readers can access words in 4 different ways. They can access words through decoding, which is that process of looking at the letters on the page, understanding what sounds they make, and blending those sounds together to form words. Readers recognize some words through sight, and those are words that are already in their memory, most likely because they've decoded them or they've seen them many times. Readers access words through analogy. So recognizing that a word has a part that is familiar to them from because of their knowledge of another word, and that part could be meaning based, like a morpheme, or it could be spelling or phonics based. And sometimes readers use prediction to access words, and that would include context clues, linguistic and background knowledge, perhaps illustrations or graphics that are in the text to anticipate or guess the identity of the known word. And it's important to recognize that that guess is because of clues that they find other places in the text. And readers move seamlessly between these different ways of recognizing words. So we go back to the National Reading Panel report. There hasn't been anything of its kind done since then. So we go back to the National Reading Panel report for a reminder that systematic phonics instruction is critical. And it's critical when compared to unsystematic or no phonics instruction. This is a reminder from Timothy Shanahan. I think it's important to remember that the word systematic is not the same as the word synthetic. Some of the earlier hidden slides explained different types of phonics instruction, and one of those types of phonics instruction is synthetic phonics instruction that happens outside of, I guess I would best describe it as happening outside of text that students read or text that students create. So systematic and synthetic are not the same thing. Systematic simply means that the instruction follows a scope and sequence rather than sort of picking and choosing skills based on formative assessment data. Now, there is a place for reviewing skills, reteaching skills, determining the speed at which you move through skills based on what you know about your students from formative assessment. So why teach phonics? Our language is alphabetic, so we have to be able to understand the code, understand what the sounds, the letters on the page represent. We have a huge language. We have an even larger written language than we do spoken language. And we have to be able, we can't use memorization to know all of those words or as our primary word ID strategy. We need decoding. Um, and our decoding skills are not necessarily intuitive or learned through osmosis. It's a sound system, sound symbol correspondence that needs to be directly taught. And these decoding skills are a way for students to become independent readers because they have a skill that they can use for problem solving unfamiliar and difficult words. And if you remember several slides back, decoding isn't the only skill that students use, but it is a skill that leads to recognizing words in memory. It's a skill that leads to recognizing words in analogy. So 3 of the 4 word level skills are based in decoding, with the 4th one being about using context clues or illustrations or other clues in the text. As I said, the phonics allows us to start to establish words as part of our sight vocabulary. And as words become, so the more times we see a word and the more times we decode a word, it becomes part of our sight vocabulary. That process of decoding for that word becomes automatic. And once that becomes automatic, less attention, less of the reader's attention is needed for word level processing. This is a lot of words on one slide. And the essence of it is that the goal of phonics instruction is to give students knowledge and skills that they can apply when they are doing the work of readers and writers. So it is absolutely essential, completely critical that we are teaching for a transfer. Doing phonics drills in isolation, isn't. That's an example of not teaching children to use the phonics in their reading and writing. So that's this step of specifically teaching kids how to apply what they're learning in the lessons and the practice to what they do as readers and writers is absolutely critical. So if you're watching the recording of this video, we invite you to pause and think about what has happened so far. Create your own definitions of the alphabetic principle and phonics, and think about the importance of these 2 concepts. What was affirming for you? What was new? What do you maybe want to push back on? And finally, what would you like to learn more about?
Thanks, Barb. So Barb just gave us a lot of background information. And now what we're going to do is take some time to dive in a little bit deeper to some of those topics that Barb provided just a broad background overview about. And that first topic is about systematic instruction. And again, whenever we're talking about systematic instruction, we are talking about having a scope and sequence. So where can we look to help us inform what should be in that scope and sequence? One of the places that we can look to is our academic standards. And so what you see here on your screen is an example of the phonics standard for kindergarten, grade 1, and grade 2. And we have additional standards within this category. We also have additional standards for students in grades 3 through 5, but the focus of this webinar is really on students in grades kindergarten through grade 2. And so that's where our focus is, and we're not going to see those other standards. When to begin phonics instruction. So language development is the first consideration, and that really includes the ability to recognize and produce speech sounds, to start using language structures, and engaging with meaning, using language appropriately. But remember that all of these skills don't develop in some kind of a lockstep order. And you may remember us saying that quite a few times in previous webinars in this series. While there are some skills that we would look to see some evidence of before we begin phonics instruction can be happening in parallel with other phonics knowledge. So for example, concept of word in a text develops in parallel with students' phonics knowledge of letter sound correspondences. We also know from the National Reading Panel report on reading that phonics instruction produces the biggest impact on growth in reading when it begins in kindergarten or first grade before children have learned to read independently. And so these results really clearly indicate to us that systematic, again, having a scope and sequence with our phonics instruction in kindergarten and first grade is highly beneficial. And so to be effective, we want to introduce this in kindergarten, but we also want to be appropriate. That instruction must be appropriately designed and must begin with foundational knowledge involving letters and phonemic awareness. And again, we want to remind you that phonics is just one component of the overall reading process. And it's always important to keep that in mind. This is one piece of a much larger puzzle. And so our phonics work always needs to be integrated or needs to be a part of a larger reading instruction to create a balanced reading program. Because we also have evidence that shows us if we have an overemphasis on phonics at the expense of other pieces of our reading system, that ultimately that's not going to be helpful for our learners. In fact, quite the opposite. So at this point, if you're watching the recording of this webinar, this is another place that we invite you to take a pause and consider these questions. Think about within your instructional materials or your curriculum, what is the scope and sequence for the alphabetic principle and phonics? Can you identify that? Which parts of that scope and sequence do you fully understand? And which parts do you want to know more about? What is it that you want to learn specific to your scope and sequence? Next, we'll make a connection to the foundational reading skills tool. So these are some of the components of the foundational reading skills tool. And so we're really in these two circled boxes. We're talking about instructional practices and we're talking about phonological processing as part of a larger complex system. Again, just one part of a larger system. And so these are the places in the first that we're going to zero in on. So here are some sample statements from the Foundational Reading Skills tool. So for alphabetic principle, you can see that some statements that you would use to determine whether or not you have strong instructional practice occurring in your school or across similar grade level classrooms would be these. The first one there, assessing for both speed and accuracy of letter and sound recognition. So that's one thing that you would be on the lookout for as an alphabetical principle instructional practice. Next, we're going to move to talking about explicit instruction, taking again a deeper dive into this idea of gradual release of responsibility and instructional practices. And I believe that Barb is going to take this first.
Yep. Thanks, Laura. So this is a reminder that the examples that we're giving you are intended to result in instruction that is explicit and systematic, no matter what your current situation is, whether you're face-to-face or hybrid or asynchronous or live virtual or any other number of things in between. It is also important to remember that instruction should be utilizing a gradual release of responsibility. Um, we're looking at these strategies in isolation, these instructional strategies, but they're really meant to be used in a larger framework where a learning target is introduced, a teacher models, students are engaged in guided practice, where there's lots of mistakes being made and the teacher or other students are providing feedback. And finally, students are able to apply that skill independently. So as we look at these strategies, you'll notice that some of them might fit better than others into particular points within that gradual release of responsibility. And finally, instruction should be deliberate and purposeful. So when we choose a strategy, we choose that strategy because it teaches us, it allows us to teach or practice a specific skill. We may also be choosing one instructional strategy over another because it allows us to really get students talking or have music experiences or have movement experiences. I know that we might be in situations where singing is very limited right now because of the COVID, but that's also another option to use something like song. So, as we're choosing instructional strategies for the alphabetic principle, we're remembering that we begin with the letter names, then the letter shapes, and finally the letter sounds. Um, the instruction can certainly be informal. So maybe that means it happens during as part of a transition time or as part of a calming activity as students are gathering on the carpet. So it can be informal in that way. Maybe it happens when you're walking down the hall on the way to another location in the building. So informal, but still planned and filled with opportunities for students to play with letters, compare letters, be silly and have fun around letters. So we might be learning letter names by singing songs or reciting rhymes. And we might be learning letter shapes by playing with blocks or plastic letters, maybe alphabetic books. And often there can be a knowledgeable other there helping the student, especially during those sort of non-structured or play times, recognize the letters on the blocks or give a name to the plastic letters that they might be using. These are the letter level skills that must be considered. Students need to be able to recognize letters, name letters, produce letters, which is printing individual letters. It could also be typing individual letters for students for whom printing is not a possibility yet. Letter sound association. And then finally, we're teaching for transfer. So students are able to apply those letter level skills to decode words. I would also add that they're able to use those letter level skills to write words. This is a much more robust list of what children need to know about letters. And one of the things that I'll point out here is, again, teacher vocabulary. So are you gonna, in your school, are you gonna say uppercase? Are you gonna say lowercase? And you need to be consistent about that between teachers and between grade levels. I guess the alternative would be like big letters and little letters, or capital letters and lowercase letters.